The morning sun cast long shadows across the private terminal at Los Angeles International Airport as Sarah Chen Williams checked her watch for the third time. It was 7:45 a.m., and she was early for her 8:30 a.m. flight to New York. Being punctual was just one of many habits that had helped her build her successful career as a venture capitalist. Sarah adjusted the strap of her leather laptop bag on her shoulder. At 34, she had already achieved what many people spent their whole lives working toward. Her investment firm, Future Bridge Capital, managed over $2 billion in assets, and she had recently been named one of Forbes' 40 under 40 entrepreneurs to watch. The crisp morning air felt refreshing against her face as she walked from her Tesla Model X toward the terminal entrance. She had chosen a casual but professional outfit for the day: dark jeans, a white silk blouse, and a navy blazer. Her natural hair was styled in neat braids, and she wore minimal jewelry, just her grandmother's pearl earrings and her wedding ring. Inside her bag, her phone buzzed again. It was probably another message from her assistant, reminding her about the tech conference schedule in New York. Sarah had been looking forward to this event for months. She was scheduled to give a keynote speech about investing in minority-owned businesses, a cause she was deeply passionate about. As she approached the terminal's glass doors, Sarah noticed her reflection and straightened her blazer. 10 years ago, she would have felt nervous walking into places like this. But now, after countless flights and business meetings, the private terminal felt as familiar as her office. She had earned her place here, building her company from the ground up after graduating from Stanford Business School. The terminal's interior was quiet and elegant, with soft lighting and comfortable leather chairs scattered throughout the waiting area. The walls displayed abstract art pieces, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and leather. Only a few other passengers were present, most of them absorbed in their phones or laptops. Sarah's mind wandered to the meeting she had just finished in Los Angeles. Future Bridge Capital was about to close a major deal with a promising tech startup founded by two young black women. The company had developed an innovative artificial intelligence platform for healthcare, and Sarah knew it had enormous potential. This was exactly the kind of investment she had built her reputation on: finding overlooked talent and helping them succeed. Walking toward the security checkpoint, Sarah pulled out her credentials and flight documentation. She had done this hundreds of times before. Her pilots, Mike and James, usually recognized her immediately. She had flown with them at least 20 times in the past year alone. But today, she noticed unfamiliar faces at the security desk. The morning light streamed through the terminal's tall windows, creating patterns on the polished floor. Sarah could see her chartered jet through the glass, a sleek Gulfstream G650 with the Future Bridge Capital logo on its tail. She had purchased it last year after her company's most successful quarter ever. The jet wasn't just a luxury. It was a necessity for her busy schedule, allowing her to attend meetings across the country at a moment's notice. She pulled out her phone to check her messages while walking. Her assistant had indeed sent several updates about the New York conference. There was also a sweet good morning text from her husband, Michael, with a picture of their 5-year-old daughter Emma eating breakfast. Sarah smiled, thinking about how Emma had insisted on wearing mismatched socks to school that morning. As she approached the security checkpoint, Sarah noticed one of the guards watching her intently. She was used to being noticed, sometimes for her success, sometimes for her race, often for both. She had learned to navigate these moments with grace and professionalism, though she wished she didn't have to. Little did Sarah know that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but ordinary. As she stepped toward the security desk, she was about to face a situation that would not only test her patience, but would also spark a national conversation about prejudice in places of privilege. James Morton stood at his security post, his gray uniform pressed and badge polished to perfection. After 15 years of working at LAX's private terminal, he thought he knew every type of person who belonged here. The moment he saw Sarah Chen Williams walking confidently toward the checkpoint, his face hardened with suspicion. "Excuse me, miss," Morton called out, stepping directly into Sarah's path. His voice carried that fake politeness that barely hid something uglier underneath. "The main terminal is in the other direction. This is a private area." Sarah paused, maintaining her professional composure despite the immediate understanding of what was happening. She'd been in similar situations before, though not recently. "Good morning," she replied calmly, holding out her credentials and flight documentation. I'm Sarah Chen Williams. I have a flight scheduled for 8:30. Morton barely glanced at the papers in her hand. Ma'am, this is a private terminal for authorized personnel and charter clients only. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. He stood with his hands on his hips, his body language making it clear he wouldn't budge. Yes, I understand that, Sarah said, her voice steady but firm. As you can see from my documentation, I'm the owner of Future Bridge Capital. That's our jet right there. She pointed through the window at the Gulf Stream with our company's logo clearly visible. Morton let out a short, dismissive laugh. Right, and I'm the King of England. He turned to his colleague, another security guard who was watching the scene unfold with obvious discomfort. Can you believe this? Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but years of dealing with prejudice in boardrooms and business meetings had taught her how to handle such situations. She reached for her phone and began recording. Sir, I'd like to speak with your supervisor. Listen here, Morton said, his voice getting louder. I don't care what kind of papers you've managed to get your hands on. I know every real client who comes through these doors, and you're not one of them. Other passengers in the terminal began to notice the commotion. Some pretended not to see, while others openly stared. A few had their phones out, also recording the incident. Mr. Morton, Sarah said, reading his name tag, I've flown from this terminal dozens of times. I own the jet I'm about to board. You can verify this with my pilots, Mike Chen, and James Rodriguez, or with your supervisor. But Morton wasn't listening anymore. His face had turned red, and he stepped even closer to Sarah. I'm going to call security if you don't leave right now. We get people like you trying to sneak in here all the time. People like me? Sarah repeated, her eyebrow raised. She continued recording as she pulled out her phone and opened her Forbes magazine profile. Perhaps you'd like to explain exactly what you mean by that. Morton's colleague, a younger guard named Tom, finally spoke up. James, maybe we should check her credentials properly. Stay out of this, Tom, Morton snapped. I've been doing this job since before you were out of high school. I know how to spot people who don't belong here. Sarah remained calm but stood her ground. Sir, what you're doing right now is being recorded. I'm giving you one more opportunity to check my credentials properly and allow me to board my flight. Oh, so now you're threatening me. Morton's voice rose even higher. That's it. I'm calling security. He reached for his radio. Please do, Sarah replied coolly. And while you're at it, you might want to call the terminal manager. I sit on the board of directors for this facilities management company. Morton froze for a moment, his hand on his radio, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. More lies, he muttered, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. You're going to regret trying to pull this stunt. Just then, the door to the jet bridge opened. Sarah knew that her pilots would be coming to check on her delay. What Morton didn't know was that his entire world was about to turn upside down, and his 15 years of working at the terminal were about to come to a dramatic crossroads. Captain Mike Chen emerged from the jet bridge, his pilot's uniform crisp and neat. He immediately spotted Sarah and the tense situation unfolding at the security checkpoint. Behind him, First Officer James Rodriguez also appeared, both pilots quickly assessing the scene before them. Mrs. Chen Williams. Captain Chen called out, walking briskly toward the group. Is everything all right? We were getting worried about the delay. Morton's face dropped slightly, but he held his position. You know this person? He asked the pilot, his voice thick with disbelief. Know her? Captain Chen looked confused. Sir, Mrs. Chen Williams owns our company. We've been her pilots for the past 3 years. He turned to Sarah. Is there a problem here? Sarah kept her phone recording as she explained. Mr. Morton here seems to believe my credentials are fake. He's refused to check them properly and has made some interesting assumptions about who belongs in this terminal. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Several passengers were openly filming the confrontation on their phones. Among them was a well-known tech CEO who had met Sarah at various industry events. He stepped forward. Sarah Chen Williams. What's going on here? Morton's face had turned from red to pale. Still, he tried to maintain his authority. I was just following protocol. We have strict security procedures. Which don't include racial profiling, Sarah interrupted firmly. Your protocol requires you to check credentials, not make assumptions based on appearance. First Officer Rodriguez had been quietly making some calls on his phone. Within minutes, the terminal manager, Patricia Walsh, came hurrying toward the scene. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached. "Mrs. Chen Williams," Patricia said, clearly distressed. "I just got word of what's happening. I am so terribly sorry." She turned to Morton, her expression hardening. "James, what is the meaning of this?" Morton started to stammer. "I was just trying to maintain security." She didn't look like. "Didn't look like what?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying across the now silent terminal. "Didn't look like someone who could own a private jet. Someone who could run a billion-dollar investment firm. Please, finish that sentence." Patricia quickly intervened. "Mrs. Chen Williams, please accept our deepest apologies. James, report to my office immediately after your shift." She turned to the gathering crowd. "Please, everyone, return to your business." But Sarah wasn't finished. She turned to address the onlookers, many still recording. "This isn't just about me. How many other qualified professionals have been treated this way? How many deals have been missed, meetings delayed, opportunities lost because someone decided they didn't look right?" The tech CEO nodded in agreement, adding, "This is exactly why we need more diversity in every sector. Sarah, you should share that video." Sarah's phone buzzed. Her social media notifications were exploding as clips of the incident had already started circulating online. Hashtag Privat Terminal Prejudice was trending, and her story was being shared by thousands. Morton stood frozen, watching his 15-year career crumbling before his eyes. The realization of his mistake finally seemed to hit him. "Mrs. Chen Williams, I..." "Save it," Sarah said, holding up her hand. "What I want now is action, not apologies." She turned to Patricia. "I'd like to schedule a meeting with your management team. This needs to be addressed systematically." Captain Chen gently reminded everyone, "Mrs. Chen Williams has a keynote speech to deliver in New York. We need to get moving if we're going to make it on time." As Sarah finally walked toward her jet, escorted by both pilots and Patricia, she could hear people in the terminal talking. Some were making calls, others were typing furiously on their phones. What had started as one security guard's prejudiced assumptions had sparked a conversation that would soon reach far beyond the walls of this private terminal. Behind them, Morton stood alone, his shoulders slumped. He watched as Sarah boarded her jet, the same jet he had been so sure she couldn't possibly own. The morning sun through the terminal windows now felt harsh and revealing, illuminating not just the space, but the biases that had been lurking in its shadows all along. As Sarah's private jet soared over the American heartland, the incident at LAX was creating waves far below. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since takeoff. The video of her confrontation with Morton had gone viral, reaching millions of views in just a few hours. Captain Chen's voice came over the intercom. "Mrs. Chen Williams, we're cruising at 40,000 feet now. Flight time to New York will be about 4 hours and 20 minutes. Sarah sat in her leather seat, finally allowing herself to process the morning's events. Her assistant, Jenny Park, sat across from her, managing the flood of incoming messages and media requests. "The New York Times wants to interview you," Jenny said, looking up from her tablet. "So do CNN, MSNBC, and Forbes. Your video has been shared by several celebrities and business leaders." She paused before adding, "Even the governor of California tweeted about it." Sarah took a sip of her green tea, thinking carefully. What's the general response been like? "Overwhelming support," Jenny replied, scrolling through her phone. But it sparked a bigger conversation. Hundreds of successful professionals are sharing similar stories. It's not just about one racist guard anymore. It's exposing a systemic problem. Meanwhile, back at LAX, James Morton sat in Patricia Walsh's office, watching his own face on the office computer screen as the video played. His actions, his words, his prejudices, all laid bare for the world to see. The video had already reached the corporate headquarters of the terminal management company. "Do you understand what you've done?" Patricia asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Mrs. Chen Williams isn't just any client. She's one of our most respected customers and a board member. Her investment firm manages portfolios worth billions. But even if she wasn't any of those things, your behavior was completely unacceptable." Morton stared at his hands, his voice barely a whisper. I've worked here for 15 years. And in those 15 years, how many other people did you treat this way? Patricia demanded. How many didn't have the power or platform to expose it? Before Morton could respond, Patricia's phone rang. It was the CEO of the terminal management company. She put it on speaker. The board is meeting in an hour, the CEO announced. Mrs. Chen Williams' social media posts have garnered international attention. This isn't just about LAX anymore. Private terminals across the country are being scrutinized. We need to take immediate action. Back on the jet, Sarah was preparing for her keynote speech while reading through the thousands of messages she'd received. One particularly caught her eye, a young black woman who wrote about giving up her dreams of being a pilot because of constant discrimination at flight school. Jenny, Sarah called to her assistant. Get me the contact information for our education investment team. I think we just found our next project. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Michael, her husband. Emma saw you on TV, he said when she answered. She asked why the man was being mean to Mommy. I didn't know what to tell her. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. Tell her Mommy stood up not just for herself, but for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere. As the jet continued its journey east, the story was spreading faster than they were flying. News helicopters were already waiting at the private terminal in New York. What had started as one guard's prejudiced assumptions had transformed into a national movement. Sarah opened her laptop to revise her keynote speech. She had planned to talk about investment strategies and market trends. Instead, she began typing a new opening. Today, I was reminded that no matter how high you climb, society's prejudices can still try to pull you down. But I was also reminded of something more important. The power we have to turn moments of discrimination into catalysts for change. The jet cruised on through clear skies, carrying not just its passengers, but a story that would force private aviation, corporate America, and society at large to confront their deep-seated biases. And James Morton, sitting in that office back at LAX, was about to learn that his worst mistake would ultimately lead to one of the industry's biggest transformations. Sarah's private jet touched down at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, where a very different scene awaited her. Instead of prejudice and suspicion, she found a lineup of reporters, photographers, and television crews. The terminal staff stood at attention, their faces showing a mix of respect and embarrassment for their industry. Mrs. Chen Williams, reporters called out as she stepped off her jet. What message do you have for other minorities facing discrimination? Will you press charges against the guard? Are you planning to sue the terminal? Jenny quickly moved ahead, creating a path through the crowd. Sarah walked confidently, her head held high. She stopped at the microphone stand that had been set up near the terminal entrance. What happened to me this morning happens to people of color every day, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. The only difference is that I had the platform to make it visible. But this isn't about punishing one person or one company. It's about changing the system. Inside the terminal, everyone stopped to watch her speak. The cleaning staff, the security guards, the pilots. All eyes were on the screens showing her live statement. I've decided not to pursue legal action, she continued, causing whispers among the reporters. Instead, I'm announcing the creation of the Future Bridge Inclusion Initiative. My firm will invest $50 million in programs aimed at increasing diversity in aviation, corporate leadership, and private transportation sectors. Back in Los Angeles, James Morton sat in his small apartment, watching Sarah's speech on his television. His phone had been ringing non-stop, old colleagues, friends, even his mother had called after recognizing him in the viral video. He felt sick to his stomach as he listened to Sarah's words. The guard who stopped me this morning thought he knew what success looks like, Sarah said to the cameras. He thought he knew who belongs in certain spaces. That kind of thinking doesn't just hurt individuals. It hurts our entire society. We lose out on talent, on perspectives, on progress. In the terminal management company's corporate office, the board of directors watched the press conference in silence. The CEO's face showed both relief and concern. Sarah wasn't suing, but her next words would change their industry forever. I'm calling on all private aviation companies to join our initiative, she announced. We need comprehensive bias training, diverse hiring practices, and clear accountability measures. My team has already drafted a framework for these changes, and we're ready to work with any company willing to implement them. Jenny handed Sarah a folder, and she continued. Inside this folder are the stories of hundreds of professionals who faced similar discrimination. Stories they shared with me just today. Stories that have gone unheard for too long. The crowd of reporters grew silent as Sarah shared some of these stories. The black executive who was told to use the service entrance, the Hispanic pilot who was repeatedly mistaken for cleaning staff, the Asian businessman who was asked to show 3 forms of ID while his white colleagues walked through with just a nod. In his apartment, Morton switched off his TV and sat in silence. His phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia Walsh. Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. We're implementing new training programs. Your participation will be part of your probation terms. Meanwhile, Sarah's phone lit up with a message from one of the largest private aviation companies in the world. We're in. Let's change this industry together. As the day drew to a close, Sarah finally sat down in her hotel room in New York. She called home to say goodnight to Emma. "Mommy, are you still coming to my ballet recital on Saturday?" Emma asked. "Of course, sweetheart," Sarah smiled. "And you know what? Mommy did something important today. Something that might help make the world a little better for you when you grow up." "Better than ballet?" Emma asked seriously. Sarah laughed, feeling the tension of the day finally release. "Different than ballet, but just as important." As she ended the call, Sarah looked out at the New York skyline. Tomorrow, she would give her keynote speech at the tech conference. But today, she had already delivered her most important message, one that would echo through corporate boardrooms, private terminals, and beyond, forcing people to confront their biases and consider change. 2 weeks after the incident, that LAX private terminal looked very different. New posters about inclusion decorated the walls, and a more diverse security team greeted passengers. But the biggest change was happening in the terminal's main conference room. James Morton sat at the back of the room, wearing civilian clothes instead of his security uniform. Around him, 20 other security staff members listened intently to their instructor, Dr. Lisa Chen, a diversity and inclusion expert hired by Sarah's company. "Bias isn't always obvious," Dr. Chen explained, pointing to slides showing various scenarios. "Sometimes we don't even know we're doing it. That's why we call it unconscious bias." Morton's hands trembled slightly as he took notes. The past 2 weeks had been the hardest of his life. His face had been all over the news, and his teenage daughter had come home crying because kids at school were calling her father a racist. Meanwhile, in New York, Sarah sat in a meeting with executives from 12 major private aviation companies. Jenny was beside her, taking notes as Sarah presented the Future Bridge Inclusion Initiative's detailed plans. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, standing at the head of the table, "the incident at LAX wasn't unique. It was just the first time someone had enough power to make it visible." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about discrimination in private aviation. Back in the LAX training room, Dr. Chen played the video of Morton and Sarah's confrontation. Morton wanted to sink into his chair, but the instructor's next words surprised him. "Mr. Morton has agreed to share his perspective," Dr. Chen said kindly. "James, would you like to tell the group what you've learned?" Morton slowly stood up, his face red but determined. "I've worked here for 15 years, he began, his voice shaky. "I always thought I was just doing my job, keeping the terminal secure. But watching that video, seeing myself, I realized I wasn't protecting anything. I was just acting on prejudices I didn't even know I had." In New York, Sarah's presentation reached its key point. "We're not looking to shame anyone," she explained to the executives. "We want to create lasting change. That's why our initiative includes funding for training, recruitment programs for minorities in aviation, and support for employees who speak up about discrimination." The CEO of the largest charter company raised his hand. "Mrs. Chen Williams, your proposal would cost our industry millions to implement." Sarah smiled confidently. "And discrimination costs you billions in lost talent and opportunities. I have the data to prove it." She nodded to Jenny, who distributed detailed financial reports. Back at LAX, Morton continued sharing with his colleagues. "My grandfather was a security guard too," he said. "He taught me to be suspicious of people who didn't belong. I never questioned what that meant until now." Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. And what would you say to Mrs. Chen Williams if she were here today? Morton took a deep breath. I'd say I'm sorry, but I know that's not enough. I'd tell her that I'm learning, that I'm changing, and that I want to be part of the solution now. In her New York meeting, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Patricia Walsh. Training program going well. Even James Morton is making progress. Your initiative is already making a difference. Sarah showed the message to Jenny, then turned back to the executives. Change isn't just possible, she declared. It's happening right now. The question is, will your companies lead this change, or will you be forced to follow it? One by one, the executives began nodding. The CDO, who had questioned the costs earlier, spoke up. Count us in. All of our terminals will implement your program. As the day ended, Sarah called home to talk to Emma. How was school today, sweetheart? Good, Emma replied. We learned about Rosa Parks in history class. Daddy said she was brave like you, Mommy. Sarah felt tears in her eyes. Well, Rosa Parks changed the whole world. I'm just trying to change a small part of it. But Daddy says small changes add up to big ones, Emma said wisely. Sarah smiled, looking out at the New York sunset. Her daughter was right. Change happened one person at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of bravery at a time. And somewhere in Los Angeles, James Morton was proving that even the most deeply rooted biases could be overcome with education, understanding, and the willingness to change. 3 months after the incident, Sarah's private jet landed once again at LAX. This time, she wasn't alone. With her was a group of young aviation students, 5 women and 3 men, all from minority backgrounds. They were the first recipients of the Future Bridge Aviation Scholarship. Welcome to LAX Private Terminal. A familiar voice greeted them as they entered the building. It was James Morton, now wearing a different uniform, a blue blazer with a Diversity and Inclusion Ambassador badge. Sarah stopped, surprised to see him in this new role. The students behind her whispered, recognizing both Sarah and Morton from the viral video they'd studied in their training program. Mrs. Chen Williams, Morton said, his voice steady but humble. These must be our new scholarship students. Would you mind if I gave them the terminal tour? I've been working with Patricia to develop a special program about aviation security and inclusive practices. Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. I think that would be very appropriate, Mr. Morton. Sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons. As Morton led the students through the terminal, he shared not just security protocols, but also his personal journey. 3 months ago, I stood right here and made the biggest mistake of my career, he told them, but thanks to Mrs. Chen Williams' response, that mistake became an opportunity for change. Meanwhile, Sarah met with Patricia Walsh in her office. The walls now displayed framed certificates showing completion of various diversity training programs. A large screen showed live feeds from other private terminals across the country, all implementing the Future Bridge initiative. The numbers are impressive, Patricia reported, showing Sarah the latest data. Complaints about discrimination are down 85%. We've hired 30% more minority staff, and our customer satisfaction ratings have actually improved. Sarah smiled, remembering the executives who had worried about the program's costs. And how are the other terminals doing? They're following our lead, Patricia replied proudly. Your initiative has become the industry standard. Even international terminals are requesting our training materials. In another part of the terminal, Morton showed the students the security checkpoint where the incident had occurred. This spot changed my life, he told them, but more importantly, it's changing our industry. One of the students, a young black woman named Maya, raised her hand. Mr. Morton, weren't you afraid of losing your job after what happened? Morton nodded seriously. I was. But Mrs. Chen Williams showed me something important. That real change doesn't come from punishment, but from education and understanding. Back in Patricia's office, Sarah's phone buzzed with exciting news. The Federal Aviation Administration had just announced new guidelines for diversity and inclusion in private aviation, based largely on the Future Bridge Initiative's recommendations. We're making history, Patricia said, reading the announcement over Sarah's shoulder. And to think it all started because one security guard made a mistake, Sarah finished. And because we chose to turn that mistake into a movement. Later that day, as Sarah prepared to leave, she passed Morton finishing his tour with the students. They were all engaged, asking questions about security procedures and aviation careers. Maya was taking detailed notes, her eyes bright with interest. "Thank you, Mr. Morton," Maya said as the tour ended. "You've shown us that everyone can change, and that's really important for future leaders to understand." Morton caught Sarah's eye across the terminal and gave a small, respectful nod. She nodded back, acknowledging how far they'd both come from that confrontation 3 months ago. As Sarah boarded her jet for her flight home, Captain Chen mentioned that air traffic control had a special message for her. The controller's voice came through clear. "Mrs. Chen Williams, on behalf of the aviation community, thank you for helping us build a more inclusive sky." Looking out the window as they took off, Sarah could see the LAX terminal growing smaller below, but its impact was only growing larger. The changes starting here were spreading across the country, opening doors and minds, one terminal, one person, one conversation at a time. In her seat, Sarah opened her laptop to review applications for the next round of aviation scholarships. Among them was one from Morton's daughter, who wrote about how her father's journey had inspired her to pursue a career in aviation management, focusing on inclusive practices and diverse representation. 1 year had passed since the incident that changed the private aviation industry. Sarah Chen Williams stood at a podium in the LAX private terminal's newly built conference center, addressing a room full of aviation professionals, students, and media representatives. "When I walked into this terminal a year ago," Sarah began, "I faced discrimination. Today, I stand here to celebrate transformation." She gestured to the diverse crowd before her, representing airlines, private terminals, and aviation schools from across the country. In the front row sat James Morton, now the National Director of Diversity and Inclusion Training for private aviation terminals. Beside him was his daughter Ashley, now a second-year aviation management student and one of the Future Bridge Scholarship recipients. "Our initiative has trained over 5,000 aviation professionals," Sarah continued, showing slides of the year's achievements. "We provided scholarships to 200 minority students, and our partner terminals have increased diverse hiring by 150%. Maya, the student from the first scholarship group, now stood proudly in her pilot's uniform. She had just completed her training and would be flying her first commercial flight next week. She caught Morton's eye and smiled, remembering how his honest sharing of his journey had inspired her during that first terminal tour. Patricia Walsh stepped up to the podium next. "The lax incident could have ended with anger and lawsuits," she said. "Instead, thanks to Mrs. Chen Williams' vision, it became the catalyst for the biggest positive change our industry has ever seen." The audience applauded as Sarah unveiled the terminal's new training center name, the Bridge Center for Inclusive Aviation. The modern facility would serve as the main training hub for aviation professionals across the country. Morton was called to speak next. His hands no longer trembled when he addressed crowds. "A year ago, I was the face of what was wrong in our industry," he said honestly. "Today, I work to be part of what's right. My journey from security guard to inclusion director proves that change is possible when we open our minds and hearts." In the audience, Emma, now 6 years old, watched her mother proudly. She wore a tiny pilot's pin that Maya had given her, dreaming of her own future in aviation. Next to her, Michael squeezed her hand, beaming with pride. After the ceremony, Sarah walked through the terminal with Jenny, who was now the Chief Operating Officer of the Future Bridge Initiative. The walls displayed photographs of their scholarship recipients, successful minority aviation professionals, and news articles about the industry's transformation. "Remember what Emma said about small changes adding up?" Sarah asked Jenny. "Look how far we've come." They passed the security checkpoint where everything had started. The spot now had a small plaque reading, "Change takes courage," dedicated to everyone who dared to make a difference. Later that evening, a special dinner was held to celebrate the anniversary. Maya stood up to make a surprise announcement. She had been hired as a pilot for a major airline, becoming one of the youngest black female pilots in commercial aviation. Morton's daughter Ashley also shared news. She had created a mentorship program connecting experienced aviation professionals with minority students interested in the field. The program would be implemented across all partner terminals next month. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing with Morton near the terminal windows, watching planes take off into the sunset. Did you ever imagine we'd end up here? Morton asked quietly. Sarah shook her head. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes. You proved that transformation is possible, James. Your journey helped others believe in change. Emma ran up to them, excited to show off her pilot's pin. Morton knelt down to her level, smiling. You know, young lady, your mom helped make the sky a better place for everyone. I know, Emma said proudly. And when I grow up, I'm going to fly planes and help people just like Mommy and Maya. As Sarah watched her daughter chatting with Morton about airplanes, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The incident that could have ended in bitterness had instead sparked a movement of positive change. The private terminal that had once been a site of discrimination had become a beacon of inclusion. The sun set over Lax, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Below, planes took off and landed, carrying people of all backgrounds, their dreams no longer limited by prejudice but lifted by possibility. The bridge to a more inclusive future had been built, one brave conversation, one changed mind, one open door at a time.